Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Today we'll be delving into a most peculiar and unsettling piece of footage uploaded to YouTube by a channel called Alluvium. It appears to depict, you guessed it, a malfunctioning PS1 game. So, yeah, that's kind of my specialty. In reality, this is a creepy web series known as Valle Verde. I should let you know up front that there are a number of disturbing elements in this footage, so keep that in mind prior to watching it. I'm going to be breaking up this analysis in a manner that I think is appropriate for the purposes of both my workflow and what I have discerned to be the overall structure of the work itself. In this installment, I'll be covering the first 5 minutes of the footage, and I must say, it is a veritable cornucopia of symbol, subtext, and intertextual references, all ready to be dissected and deciphered by yours truly. I, for one, am thrilled to delve into this footage and unlock its secrets, but before we embark on this journey, I feel it's important to acknowledge the exceptional technical prowess on display in this video. The animation, graphics, and sound design are nothing short of remarkable, and that alone merits a standing ovation. The meticulous attention to detail combined with the level of craftsmanship serves to create a truly immersive experience for the viewer. From the tranquil animation of the whimsical blimp at the beginning to the hair-raising and inconsistent graphics and sound effects as the player progresses through the game, the creators have masterfully crafted a world of nightmares that envelops the viewer in its sinister atmosphere. Frankly, I couldn't be more impressed. The work at hand not only captures the essence of a PS1 game, but also does so with a remarkable degree of authenticity. The pixelated graphics in particular elicit a sense of nostalgia for the formative years of gaming when blocky characters and low-resolution textures were the norm. These elements of the game serve as a vivid reminder of the technological limitations of the time and the boundless creative potential that lay within those constraints. However, I believe the work's adherence to the aesthetic of a PS1 era game is not simply a nostalgic exercise. The graphics, for example, not only evoke memories of your childhood, but also serve as a poignant commentary on the cognitive process of representation itself. In my view, the game's character models and simple animations function as visual allegories for the fragmented and simplified way in which we are conditioned to perceive and understand the world. A few things will be made clear over the course of this video, but I should let you know right off the bat that I am purposefully limiting the scope of this first analysis in order to focus on key findings, namely certain details related to historical and geopolitical matters. Perhaps that doesn't make sense quite yet, but you'll see what I'm talking about soon enough. At this point, it would suffice to say that the creators of this work have demonstrated a profound understanding of both the technical limitations and creative possibilities of the PS1 era. The work combines nostalgia and surrealism in order to achieve a certain effect. It's clear to me that Valle Verde invites the viewer to reflect on the nature of representation as well as our relationship with technology, but this is only really the jumping off point. We have yet to discover the hidden layers of this thing. The video was uploaded on October 5th, 2022. It's 20 minutes and 56 seconds in length, and as I previously indicated, it appears to depict a malfunctioning PS1 game. As the player begins to explore the game, the atmosphere becomes increasingly unsettling. The graphics and sound effects are inconsistent, and the characters begin to behave in strange and erratic ways. Before getting into that, I should mention some additional material. The same day this footage was uploaded, another video was uploaded on the same channel as well. If you are interested in getting more context on the backstory, check out an introduction on Alluvium's channel. Essentially, he explains that he found the video a couple of years ago buried in an isolated area. Specifically, he purports to have discovered the footage in a park in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He observed a statuette in the video's general vicinity shown here. It's only just now that he's taken a keen interest in the footage due to his friend pointing out that the game is unknown. Alluvium also states that he has meticulously reviewed the first 20 minutes of footage frame by frame out of fear that the material may contain elements that are potentially illegal. The uploader also mentions that there are things that appear and disappear in various parts of the video, and that he will upload the remainder of the footage once he completes a thorough review. And so I think it's fair to say we're going to see more uploads in the future. Before we begin our analysis of this footage, I implore you, please watch the video for yourself before watching the rest of this analysis video. The experience of viewing this firsthand is truly unsettling, and I surely would not want to deprive you of that. I have meticulously analyzed this video, and I'll be providing my insights and observations throughout this analysis, but I urge you to proceed with caution and keep an open mind, as the events depicted in this video merit a fair amount of scrutiny and inspection. I would also encourage you to subscribe to Alluvium's channel, because you're not going to want to miss future installments of this creepy web series. And so, without further ado, let's delve into the world of nightmares and see what horrors lurk within the corrupted code of this PS1 game. As we commence our examination of this video, it would seem at first glance that this game contains credible indications that it is a PS1 game geared towards children. The intro sequence is followed by a black screen displaying information about the game called Valle Verde. Apparently, it was created in Japan. The game's date of origin is listed as February 14th, 1997, and it is marked as unreleased. From this, we can perhaps discern it was scrapped for some unknown reason. It is relayed that two gentlemen have been tasked with investigating certain anomalies within the game. Specifically, Robert Saturn and Pablo L. Gutierrez are looking into problems related to malfunctioning AI, corrupted learning data, and issues with the game's specialized hardware. References to malfunctioning AI and corrupted learning data call to mind the field of machine learning. I'm certainly not an expert on the topic, so I can only really provide a cursory overview. With that in mind, machine learning is a method of teaching computers to learn from data without being explicitly programmed. It's a subset of artificial intelligence that enables machines to learn from new experiences and adapt to new inputs in order to perform tasks without the need for a human programmer stipulating all the necessary rules, or at least that's the goal. Machine learning algorithms are designed to identify patterns in data and make predictions or decisions based on the data provided to it. Machine learning is widely used in a variety of applications such as image and speech recognition, natural language processing, and self-driving cars. However, it's important to note that the game in question was supposedly created in 1997. The concept of machine learning was still in its infancy at that time, so it would be anachronistic to expect that this game would have sophisticated machine learning capabilities. However, perhaps we should suspend our disbelief strictly for the purposes of this analysis. After all, it's entirely possible within this fictional universe that certain technology was developed in a manner that can be described as ahead of the curve, so to speak. The game was apparently created by a company called Onyxware. The Shizuoka Institute for Science and Technology also seems to be involved in the game's development. To be clear, this is a real university which presumably has nothing to do with the creation of this web series. For context, the institution in question dates back to 1940, when it was first established as a driving school. However, as time passed, it transformed into a fully fledged university, chartered in 1991. Its focus is on STEM-related fields such as mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and computer technology. We should assume that the work is simply referencing a real-world institution for the purposes of world building, or at least that's the sense I get. It is perhaps the case that within the fictional context of the universe established in this video, faculty at the school were perhaps responsible for the development of the AI technology presumably employed within the game, but that's just speculation on my part. The game then loads and we find ourselves rushing across the ocean towards a mountain in the distance. The animation is abruptly cut short, indicating that perhaps the player has opted to skip the intro sequence. The title menu appears, featuring the text Valle Verde against a wooden background along with the game's logo. The player opts to start a new game. As the video progresses, we are presented with a loading screen which displays a warning to refrain from unplugging the TH brain device. A serene animation of a fantastical blimp flying across the ocean is presented. We are then shown the silhouette of a person looking out of the window of a passenger section. We are introduced to a stranger who turns out to be a man named Roddy. Roddy says, "I've never seen you here before." The player is then prompted to enter their name. The player enters Test 05, most likely indicating that the purpose of this particular gaming session is to test the game. It's quite possible to infer that the player is, in fact, one of the investigators referenced earlier in the video. It's worth noting that the use of the name Test 05 suggests that the player may have been conducting multiple tests on this game, possibly in an attempt to uncover the truth behind its malfunctioning AI and corrupted learning data. Recall that previously a series of numbers appeared on the screen along with certain information. Below the date, the numbers 05/05 are displayed. This is consistent with the idea that this video depicts the fifth and final session carried out by the investigators. This revelation adds a new layer of intrigue to the video as we begin to question the purpose of these tests and what the player may have uncovered during their investigation. The interface displays a message instructing the player to use the keyboard in the TH brain device to enter their name. This further emphasizes the central role that this TH brain device plays in the game. Based on the references made earlier in the video, perhaps the TH brain device is some sort of specialized hardware connected to the PS1 console. It's possible that it is being used to enable the game's AI capabilities. The fact that the game's malfunctioning AI and corrupted learning data are mentioned in the initial information screen suggests that the TH brain device is connected to those particular issues. After the player enters their name, Roddy remarks, "Oh, so you are new." The player is then presented with two options for how to respond: correct or "I've been here before." The player chooses correct. Roddy replies, "Welcome to Valle Verde. It's always good to receive visitors." If we take this interaction at face value, it would suggest that the player is indeed new to the game. However, the player's name, Test 05, as well as the previous references to investigations into the game's various problems, would seem to call into question the player's true identity and purpose within the game. Again, this supports the idea that the user is not a typical player, but rather someone who is testing or investigating the game's functionality. And so it makes sense to apprehend the player's response choices in that context, rather than the player providing sincere answers in order to advance within the game. They are attempting to identify phenomena which are perhaps the outcome of particular responses. As the player continues to interact with Roddy, he asks, "Speaking of which, can I take a look at your papers?" The player indicates that they do not have any papers, yet Roddy is not taken aback by this revelation. Instead, he responds, "You are lucky you came across a prepared inspector." At this point, the significance of the position inspector is unclear within the game's established universe. However, it would seem to carry some amount of authoritative weight. Roddy then offers to create a provisional document for the player, which is to be registered when they arrive at their destination. Roddy asks for some basic information in order to fill out the documentation. The text on the document reads, "Name, Test 05, age 10, birthday, January 1st. The document has a place for a signature in the lower left-hand area. The player stamps the document to confirm that this information is accurate. It could very well be that this paperwork is merely a device to ingest some basic details about the player character. However, as best I can gather, it seems that the game has simply populated the name indicated by the player as well as certain default information. In other words, this is clearly boilerplate info that has been entered for testing purposes. The player has chosen not to alter the details in the documentation. Instead, they have opted to quickly move on. Yet, this request for documentation raises some intriguing questions about the game, in particular, the society presented within the game. There are no overt red flags as of yet, but we are starting to get some implicit indications that something nefarious is perhaps going on. While it may seem innocuous, I always find it a bit ominous when a character is asked for their papers in a fictional setting. At the level of the game's narrative, this request is a subtle yet foreboding indication that some sort of governing authority is asserting its presence. This further adds to the mystery of the game as we are left wondering about the nature of the society and the purpose of these documents. Specifically, this raises new questions about the game's world and its rules. With respect to the story taking place outside the game's narrative, we also need to consider that artificial intelligence has been employed within this game, so it makes sense to assume that any information provided by the player might be used in ways we can't possibly anticipate. And so it makes sense that a user investigating this particular game would be reluctant to give it any personal information. The game's AI might be using the player's various inputs in ways that we can't possibly comprehend, and it's worth considering how the game may be using this information as we continue to analyze the footage. As the inspector finishes creating the provisional document, he puts it away, revealing the player's avatar. The player is depicted as a young boy with a blue hat and a brown backpack. This simple representation of the player character adds to the game's sense of innocence, which I assure you contrasts greatly with the eerie and unsettling occurrences to come. The scene shifts as a small airplane approaches the blimp. The plane's tail displays the symbol of a cat's face. As the airplane approaches, we can see that the pilot is a blue cartoon cat. He waves and performs a barrel roll before descending towards an island. We aren't given any further details at this point pertaining to this whimsical blue cat. Roddy then turns to the player and asks, "By the way, what's your destination?" A menu appears, giving the player the option to choose from a variety of locations on the island. As the player navigates to the menu and chooses a destination, it becomes apparent that the option selected is called Debug Shima, which is displayed conspicuously relative to the icons for other locations. The use of a debug option in the game's menu highlights the fact that this game is still in development and not yet ready for release. As the blimp descends and drops off the player on the island, the player's character exclaims, "I arrived to debug Shima. I should authenticate my documents." The player makes their way down a path and comes across a ticket taker named Bobson, who is very clearly sleeping on the job. Bobson is jarred awake by the player's presence. He greets the player. "Ahem, welcome to Debug Shima. Can I see your papers?" The player is presented with two options for how to respond. "Roddy gave me these," or "I'm new in town." The player chooses the first option. Bobson responds, okay, you must take them to Foxo in the town hall." There's a noticeable dissonance here between certain details which are meant to clearly telegraph that this is a children's game, and other more implicit details which would indicate otherwise. The player must complete some sort of documentation process in order to progress through the game, and the presence of a town hall suggests that there is a governing authority in the game's society. However, the fact that Bobson is seen sleeping on the job generally undermines this authority. We can write that detail off as comic relief, especially considering that this is a children's game, but I think it makes sense to at least note the thematic tension, namely the interplay between authority and lightheartedness. As the player makes their way through the town, they come across a bridge and the screen fades to black. We are then treated to various scenes within the town. The player is shown a golden statue in the town square, which appears to be some kind of cartoon fox. The player is then shown a building with stone columns and a bald man standing out front. Lastly, the player encounters a purple fox in a suit with a blue armband. These scenes give us a glimpse into the different characters and locations that presumably the player can interact with in the game. The use of different animal characters such as a purple fox and the blue cat shown earlier adds to the fantastical and surreal nature of the game. It leaves us wondering about the significance of these characters with respect to their role in the game's narrative. The player walks directly to the purple fox, whose name is revealed to be Foxo. Foxo greets the player. "Welcome to Debug Shima. My name is Foxo, at your service." He then says, "I have led the town hall of this town for 20 long years. What can I help you with?" The player is presented with two options. "Bobson asked me to show you these," or "I was just wandering around. I'll be right back." The player chooses the former option and presents the fox with his recently obtained documentation. Foxo responds, "Everything's all right. This credential will help you while my assistant works on your papers." You are then presented with a new item, your credentials. We are beginning to see the cultivation of a general thematic motif, that is, Governmental bureaucracy. First, the player had to obtain provisional documentation from the inspector, and now the player is being provided with credentials, which are also provisional. They're meant to be a placeholder of sorts until the player's real papers are in order. You know, there sure is a lot of paperwork in this game that is presumably meant for children. At this stage, we must acknowledge the possibility that the player is being monitored in some way. Perhaps this data is being collected by a powerful unseen entity, namely the artificial intelligence technology referenced earlier. One observation I'd like to make at this point is that the game's general theme of obtaining documentation and credentials in order to navigate the society of Valle Verde can be seen as a commentary on the various ways in which individuals are controlled and monitored by systems of control. In addition, the repeated use of the phrase debug schema could be interpreted as a commentary on the idea of debugging as a metaphor for finding and fixing errors or problems in a system. This particular medium, since it is, after all, adopting the form of a Let's Play video, tends to foster a critical mentality. In a sense, we the audience inhabit the role of the investigator, and so we are invited to pay extremely close attention to the various occurrences. Subsequently, we are invited to evaluate the system as it is presented to us. We must also consider the possibility that the game's focus on the player character as an outsider, a child who is new to the island of Valle Verde, can be understood as a metaphoric representation of an outsider's experience in a new country. The player's efforts to navigate the system and obtain documentation can be understood as a reflection on the arbitrary complexity that outsiders face in their attempts to navigate government bureaucracies and assimilate into a new culture. As Foxo continues, he draws attention to the band on his left arm, the so-called armband of leadership. He implies that the character can attain this armband as well through hard work and dedication. Foxo explains that there is one armband for every tree of knowledge. The player quickly skips over this dialogue so as to suggest they have already encountered this part of the game. It is incumbent upon any curious viewers to pause the video and focus on these details. The idea of leadership and the attainment of power is reinforced by Foxo's reference to a so-called tree of knowledge, of which there are multiple, apparently, suggesting that there is a hierarchy of knowledge and understanding in this fictional universe, and that the acquisition of this knowledge leads to power and authority. This comment about the Tree of Knowledge could also be interpreted as a reference to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve are forbidden from eating from the Tree of Knowledge. Foxo then inquires, "Have you already thought where you'll be staying?" The player is then given two options. "I haven't thought about it," and "That bush looks very comfy." The player selects the first option. Foxo responds, "No place to stay?" A light bulb appears over his head to indicate that he's had an epiphany. "Oh, I know. Follow me." The screen fades to black to indicate a transition. The player reappears along with Foxo near a rundown building. Foxo says, "Maybe it's not the most comfortable place, but it will do. The original owner left a long time ago and never came back. You can modify whatever you want." As we delve deeper into Valle Verde, it becomes increasingly clear that this game is not just a simple adventure. For example, the option to choose "That bush looks very comfy" when Foxo asks about the player's living arrangements serves as a biting commentary on the dire living conditions that many refugees are often forced to endure. It would seem that the game has cleverly employed sarcasm as a means of highlighting the dismal reality that many people have to deal with due to circumstances beyond their control. This reference is not an isolated incident. Throughout the game, we see instances of the character being asked for their papers and being subject to bureaucratic processes, allusions to the difficulties that refugees often face when trying to gain legal status in a new country. Foxo's offer to use the dilapidated building as a place for the player to stay is yet another interesting detail. This offer seems to be a reference to the conventional understanding of property ownership and the role it plays in the formation of an entrenched social hierarchy. While this clearly raises more general questions about the concept of property ownership, as well as how it is defined and upheld within this fictional world, there is a more interesting dynamic at play when it comes to Foxo's charitable offer. It's possible the fox allowing the player to live in a rundown building could be interpreted as a subtle form of criticism, specifically of the modern welfare state and, more broadly, the state's lackluster efforts to bracket off methods to deal with those living in poverty, such that they are relegated to continually navigate a hellish, never-ending bureaucratic process in order to get their basic needs met. In this sense, the building may symbolize the limited resources and opportunity available to people of limited means. Foxo's willingness to offer the building to the player despite its obvious shortcomings could be seen as a commentary on the inadequate support provided by the state to those in need. The notion that the player, a newcomer to the town, is given the opportunity to claim and shape this space for themselves speaks to the power dynamics at play within the game's society, where individuals are granted a certain degree of agency, but only within the restrictive parameters set by those in positions of authority. In the next scene, Foxo introduces the player to a new character named Jansug, who is apparently from Georgia. However, the game presents Jansug in a highly distorted manner with a strange sound effect playing briefly. It would seem that the character is attempting to relay dialogue. However, it's been distorted so as to obscure the message. This could be interpreted as the game's way of highlighting the difficulty of communication and understanding when encountering someone from a different culture or background. Additionally, the fact that Jansug does not speak could be seen as a commentary on the way in which certain groups are often silenced and not given a platform to speak for themselves. One particularly interesting detail about this scene is the specific flag on display. The work is very clearly referencing the country of Georgia as indicated by the flag. However, the flag shown is not the current Georgian flag, but rather that of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, which existed from 1918 to 1921. This flag was used before Georgia was invaded by the Soviet Union and subsequently incorporated into the USSR. The fact that the flag has been lowered to the ground suggests that the character has been relegated to a subordinate position. As this is a fictional video game, the meaning and significance of this scene is highly open to interpretation. However, it's clear enough to me that the work is referencing a specific historical moment. The Soviet invasion of Georgia in 1921 is a complex historical event with multiple factors and interpretations. The most credible explanation for the cause of the war is that it was a result of both expansionist policies by the Soviets and the efforts of Georgian Bolsheviks within the country to overthrow the government of the Democratic Republic of Georgia. The invasion was not universally agreed upon in Moscow, and it was largely engineered by two Georgian-born Soviet officials, Sergei Ordonsky and a rising star in the Communist Party named Joseph Stalin. The leader of the Soviets at the time was Vladimir Lenin, and it should be noted that he signed off on the plan to invade Georgia. The Soviet pretext for the invasion was supporting peasants and workers' rebellion in the country. However, it's also somewhat obvious that the main goal was to establish a Bolshevik regime in the country in order to bolster Soviet Russia. The Soviets were quickly able to take control of the capital and announce the foundation of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic on February 25, 1921. The rest of the country was overrun within 3 weeks. Within the context of the broader work, the deployment of this historical reference is ambiguous at this point. The use of such imagery and symbolism certainly raises questions about power, politics, and history, and perhaps it could also be interpreted as a commentary on a larger theme that has been coalescing within these first few minutes, namely the displacement of people. Foxo then takes the player to another residence. This is Kazuya from Japan, he says. In this instance, we see the flag of Japan on display. it too has been lowered to the ground. Kazuya's image appears. It would seem that this image is distorted as well. As with Jansug, a brief sound effect plays, but Kazuya does not have any dialogue. The scene abruptly transitions to another residence. Kazuya presents another example of the work employing certain historical references in order to paint a picture. The lowered Japanese flag, like the lowered Georgian flag before it, serves as a visual metaphor indicating subordination and defeat. Japan was prohibited from having armed forces with war potential under Article 9 of its constitution, which was adopted in the aftermath of World War II. The article renounces war and the maintenance of military forces and states that land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. It is certainly no coincidence that the game is set in a place called Debug Shima, a clear nod to the idea that this is a world that is still in the process of being constructed and fine-tuned. It is quite likely that the name Debug Shima also serves as a subtle yet potent historical reference. Of course, I'm speaking to the tragic events that occurred in the city of Hiroshima. The island setting of the game evokes the image of the atomic bomb's impact on an island country, Japan, thereby further emphasizing the parallels between the bombing of Hiroshima and the themes of subjugation and defeat that pervade the work. The distorted image of Kazuya, much like Jansug, adds an eerie and unsettling tone to the scene. The quick transition to another residence can be interpreted as a commentary on the rapid and tumultuous changes that can be brought about by political and military intervention. The lack of dialogue from Kazuya and Jansug suggests that their voices, and perhaps the voices of their respective nations, have been subordinated to positions of lesser status by the emerging hegemonic powers of the 20th century. In the case of Georgia, obviously I'm referring to the Soviet Union, and in the case of Japan, I'm referring to the United States. Foxo then takes the player to a third residence. This is Oliver from Ireland, says Foxo. The background briefly cuts out, and then a distorted image depicting Oliver appears. A strange sound effect plays, and the screen becomes distorted. Oliver does not relay any dialogue. We can see very plainly that the Irish flag is on display here. The Irish flag, like the Georgian and Japanese flags before it, has been lowered to the ground, again symbolizing defeat. In the case of Ireland, the subjugator is quite obviously the British Empire. In other words, the lowered Irish flag in the game may symbolize the defeat and subjugation of Ireland by the British Empire. British colonialism lasted for several centuries. It can be understood as an older, less sophisticated form of imperialism relative to that of the United States or the Soviet Union. But at its height, the British Empire controlled a vast array of territories and peoples across the globe. Ireland, being a small island nation, was particularly affected by British colonialism. The British government imposed its rule on Ireland and systematically suppressed Irish culture, language, and political autonomy. The subjugation of Ireland by the British Empire was a long and complex process that involved military conquest, political manipulation, economic exploitation, and cultural oppression. The lowered Irish flag in the game can be understood as a metaphor for the defeat and suppression of Irish sovereignty by British colonial powers. Again, the distorted image of Oliver and the lack of dialogue is a reminder of the silenced voices of the oppressed and marginalized. With the introduction of Oliver from Ireland, the pattern established in the previous scenes becomes even more apparent. And it would seem that the thematic exploration of subjugation and defeat continues yet again through the use of another historical reference. With the introduction of Chloe from France, the game continues to build upon this thematic motif. This time, the flag on display is that of France. Much like the lowered flags of Georgia, Japan, and Ireland before it, the lowered French flag serves as a visual metaphor for the nation's climactic defeat. The addition of the black substance on the ground in this scene adds a new layer of eerie and unsettling imagery. In the case of France, it is likely that the subjugator being referenced here is the German Third Reich, since France was occupied by Nazi Germany during World War II. The black substance can be understood as as a reference to the bombing of cities during war, which of course calls to mind the destruction and devastation caused by the German occupation. It serves to further reinforce the game's themes of political and military intervention and their devastating effects on individuals and nations. The inclusion of France in this narrative may also be a subtle nod to the country's own history of colonialism and imperialism. We are beginning to see the cultivation of a new thematic motif, namely cycles of history driven by military conflict and, more broadly, imperialism. The following scene with Matthias from Argentina presents an interesting deviation from the previous scenes. While the flags of Georgia, Japan, Ireland, and France have all been lowered, indicating defeat, the flag of Argentina is still standing. Perhaps this is simply a commentary on the fact that countries like Argentina were insulated in some key respects from the turmoil in Europe during the 20th century. Yet, so too does the cat character representing Matthias present a distinct visual contrast relative to the previous characters depicted. The facial expression of the cat appears to convey a sense of dissatisfaction, potentially suggesting a sense of entrapment. Additionally, Matthias seems to have difficulty moving in the game. It's almost as though he's lagging. Perhaps it can be inferred that Matthias is stuck in some kind of repetitive cycle, a kind of hellish loop as part of the game's infernal machinations. The behavior of the cat avatar adds an additional layer of intrigue, and it's possibly a commentary on the internal dynamics of Argentina. Perhaps the game is suggesting that while the country may not have been directly defeated by outside forces, it is still experiencing its own internal struggles. This repetition of symbols, the lowered flags, and distorted images, each of these elements raise the inevitable question of what exactly this work is trying to convey through these recurring details. Is it simply a commentary on the defeat of certain nations, or is there a deeper meaning to be gleaned from these eerie and unsettling scenes? It is worth considering the possibility that the flags and their respective positions depicted in the game may be representative of a narrative specific to the game, rather than reflecting the actual historical realities of these represented nations. While it is possible that the flags and their positions have more to do with the internal dynamics of the game rather than the external realities of these nations, the choice to include characters from these specific countries, Georgia, Japan, Ireland, France, and Argentina, raises questions about the scope of the work's general themes. In other words, the choice to include characters from these specific countries leads me to believe there is at least some kind of geopolitical subtext here. However, I should be extremely careful because, as far as I can tell, there is no obvious moral posture exhibited by the work, at least not based on the nations displayed. For instance, the choice to use Japan, part of the Axis powers, and France, an allied power, both as representatives of defeated nations, would seem to suggest no real immediate political commentary per se with respect to whether any particular country deserves, to put it in a vulgar manner, to be defeated or conquered based on past events. It is worth noting that the game's choice to depict characters from specific nations, coupled with the use of flags and their positioning, may not necessarily be an endorsement of a particular political stance. Instead, it may be a commentary on the cyclical nature of power and subjugation, in which all nations, regardless of their past actions, can fall victim to the winds of larger historical processes. To me, it almost seems to evoke a realist perspective. And when I say realist, I don't mean literary realism or anything like that. Rather, I'm referring to a school of thought that is largely concerned with international relations and global politics. The game's focus on the theme of subjugation and defeat, without any clear distinction between good or bad nations, aligns with the realist belief that nations act in their own self-interest and the balance of power is constantly shifting. This is precisely what is meant by the term realpolitik, the inclusion of characters from nations with differing historical alignments and fates in the context of global conflicts such as France and Japan suggests a nuanced and non-judgmental perspective on the subject of subjugation, and defeat. This approach aligns with the realist understanding of the world, which emphasizes the study of power dynamics and the objective analysis of global events, rather than making value judgments based on moral considerations. There is a kind of dialectic going on here between the individual subject, an outsider trapped in a Kafkaesque government bureaucracy within a video game, and conversely, the almost aggressively indifferent framework presented to us. The work seems to be displaying a certain kind of thematic tension between the individual, represented by the player character, and the larger framework of realist geopolitics. One could argue that the inclusion of characters from various countries in the game, along with the depiction of their respective flags in a defeated state, serves to foster empathy for the individual characters who find themselves trapped within the game. In the context of the narrative presented to us, nothing has been firmly established thus far, but it's possible that the artificial intelligence at the heart of this game is continually reproducing the conditions for these characters' subjugation. This juxtaposition of the personal and the political generates a dialectic that brings to light the various ways in which the struggles of the individual are shaped and influenced by larger systemic forces. The characters being stuck in this hellish pixelated world calls to mind those real-life individuals who are caught in the crosshairs of disasters caused by larger systemic processes playing out over time. While many details remain to be uncovered, a few things are fairly clear. In my view, this seemingly innocent children's game has been employed as a medium for a more sinister narrative. In some sense, it can be apprehended as the hellish reflection of a society that often hides or disguises its darker aspects. The work's use of a child's game as a vehicle for a darker story can be understood as a reflection on how various elements in society often present an elaborate facade of innocence, while bearing the deeper, more sinister reality at the heart of things, namely the fact that our entire economy is driven by exploitation. There is also perhaps an operation at play which serves to question the medium of video games, specifically games geared towards children. The employment of a cartoonish art style in the game can be apprehended as a comment on the ways in which various sources of media work to simplify or paper over complex issues for the purposes of accumulating profit. Beneath the surface of the game's mechanics and gameplay, there is a deeper subtext. As we delve deeper into the world of Valle Verde, it becomes increasingly clear that the game serves, at least in part, as an allegory for the experience of a refugee in a new country. The game's focus on documentation, in addition to the fact that the protagonist is constantly being asked to prove his worth and legitimacy, speaks to the way in which refugees are often treated as a burden or a problem to be managed, rather than as human beings with inherent value and dignity. For starters, the protagonist is dropped into a strange and unfamiliar land with no papers or documentation to speak of. While the various characters he has encountered thus far are cartoonish and appear to be unthreatening, the fact that they demand that he provide proof of his identity and legitimacy would seem to imply that he is regarded with suspicion and mistrust by those in positions of authority. This scenario is, of course, all too familiar for those who have been forced to flee their homes in search of safety and security. The global market system leads to various scenarios in which the movement of people across borders is often driven by the uneven distribution of resources and opportunities. As certain regions and countries experience economic growth and development, others are left behind, sometimes leading to a surge of refugees seeking a better life elsewhere. The phenomenon of mass displacement and subsequent crises surrounding the displacement of refugees can be understood as a manifestation of uneven economic development. The constant drive for profit accumulation leads to the increased exploitation of labor, resulting in a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. This disparity is not only evident within nations, but also between nations, as state powers extract wealth and resources from the global south, leaving these regions in a state of under development. It is within this context that we can understand the displacement of individuals and communities as they are forced to flee their homes in search of economic opportunity and survival. In the case of Valle Verde, we see this allegorized as the player character's journey to a new land where they are met with bureaucratic obstacles and a lack of resources, all the while bearing witness to the plight of other victims who have long since been defeated. It is quite simply a reminder that the struggles of refugees are not simply a matter of individual misfortune, but rather the result of systemic failures. Okay, winding down here, this is going to be the first in a series of videos about Valle Verde. I want to take my time with this one and sink my teeth into it because it really is a complex experimental work, and I feel as though it merits an extremely thorough investigation. If you are supportive of this endeavor, maybe think about subscribing to my Patreon. You can join for as little as $1 a month. Before coming to a close, I just wanted to let you know that I was recently interviewed for a podcast called Commendable Commotion, so check it out if you're inclined. I'll have a link in the video description. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.